Good evening and welcome to this Almeida Questions event in association with the New Statesman. We're here to launch the third series of the Almeida's Figures of Speech series. I'm Helen Lewis, I'm Deputy Editor of the New Statesman. Before I introduce our panel, we're going to play a short video so you can see a little bit of the work that the Almeida has been doing.
You graduates have every right to expect penetrating words of profound wisdom. Unfortunately, though, I'm going to have to disappoint you and present you with a multiple choice test. Choose one of 5 possible answers.
If you were a brand, what brand would you be? That's a question I was asked in an interview, a job interview, just several years ago. And let me tell you, when you're Monica Lewinsky, that's a loaded fucking question.
In my old age, I must stretch out my hands and beg. Brothers and sisters, hand them over to me. Fathers and mothers, give me your children.
My comrades are neither dead nor forgotten. They live today, more than ever, and their murderers will view with dismay the victorious spirit of their ideas rise from their corpses.
My freedom was achieved as the outcome of a massive people struggle. Young people and older people, black, brown, Asian, Native American and white people, students and workers. The people seized the keys which opened the gates to freedom.
And now let me introduce my panel. I'm going to start at this end with Amanda Abbington, who will be recognised from many of her roles on stage and screen, perhaps best known for BBC One's Sherlock. She's also, as you saw in the video, recorded an incredibly powerful speech by Monica Lewinsky called Patient Zero. Philip Collins is a Times columnist and former speechwriter to Tony Blair. He's also written, he's collected, I'm going to say, I don't think you can claim that you wrote all of the speeches in the book, but
Not
just
all of them.
some of them.
The Gettysburg Address, that was mine.
Yep, that was a great one. Maybe your best, actually. Darren Siah is a member of the Almeida's Young Leaders programme and has recorded his own contribution to the series called It's Just a Preference. And Sam Leith is Spectator literary editor and author of books on writing and rhetoric. So, Amanda, let's start with your speech, because I watched it, and it's taken from Monica Lewinsky's TED Talk, which was the first thing when she came out, really kind of re-emerged into public again after having hidden away in some shame and silence.
Yeah.
What attracted you to that speech, and what did you want to bring out from that
Well,
performance?
I didn't know what they are. The Almeida approached me, and I'd watched the first couple of series of these and just thought they were really inspiring and something that I think is good to put out there for people to question and talk about. So when they approached me with this, I didn't know what they didn't tell me it was Monica Lewinsky's speech. So when I read it, it kind of blew me away a little bit, because she was sort of, as I say in the speech, she was just hauled over the coals and was a figure of just hate for a long time. But actually, when you sort of realise that she was caught up in the maelstrom of kind of that first kind of social media chaos, you think, God, she's just a victim. You know, she's a victim of that. I mean, you know, whatever happened between the three of those people, none of the aftermath that shouldn't have happened. You know, that she was painted as this hideous person. So I immediately felt sorry for her. I immediately started following her on Twitter and sent her a message saying, I just think you're great. because I just thought, you know, I genuinely felt sorry for her because she became this victim and you know, whatever happened within that period, nobody deserves to be treated like that.
What was interesting is I remember I was quite young at the time that happened, but I can remember seeing endless pictures of her. I saw pictures of her and pictures of her. I could not tell you what her accent was, what her voice was.
No, nobody knew, did they?
And that was a powerful speech to have her give because it reclaimed her ability to speak as a subject rather than be the object of all the
and I actually
speculation.
watched it. When I got the speech sent through, I immediately went onto YouTube and had a look at it. And you can see that she's, you know, because it's her first thing. And she's terribly nervous. But what she says, I think, is so powerful, and it's so relevant, particularly for today. For you know, because I've got 2 young children, and I'm terrified of cyberbullying and how that manifests itself, and how easy it is to say something. I mean, I send all sorts of horrible things to Donald Trump and tell him what an arsehole he is, and so I'm part. You get caught up in it as well, but. I think there are, you know, the idea of somebody doing that to my kids is just like, it breaks my heart. So it's a really relevant thing at the moment that we need, and it's all about compassion, and it's all about actually thinking before you tweet or before you send something vicious. Think about what you put out into the ether and how that will have a detrimental effect on anybody else.
I think you are allowed to cyberbully people who've got nuclear weapons.
I think so, yeah.
It might be wise.
Also, he's going to build a big wall, apparently, so, you know, he deserves it.
Phil, so you wrote speeches most notably for Tony Blair, who I think was, in my lifetime, a kind of fairly rare example of a politician, apart from Obama, who was genuinely gifted at giving speeches. But can you tell us a bit more about what is the process like? How many people are involved in writing a political speech for a start?
It varies quite a lot. In the case of Blair, it was quite narrow. It ended up just the 2 of us for most of the time because we were both incredibly slack, and this is a terrible lesson to learn. We used to not do any work until the last minute. Now that's partly because that's what politics is like. Politics changes so quickly that if you write something a week before, it's probably gone out of date by the time you come around to the speech. So I had this thing where when I first started working for him, I would very diligently write a whole speech and take it down a week before, and he wouldn't read it, and then he'd give it me back and he'd say, oh, I didn't like that. And I realised that actually the thing to do was to then give him the same speech about 5 days later, and he'd say, oh, that's much better. Yeah, because he'd think I added everything in. We'd mostly write it all on the day before. So it was really, really rapid. Night before and then very early in the morning. And Blair was the last of the pre-social media, pre-internet prime ministers, because I would turn up in Downing Street very early on a Saturday morning usually, and he would be sitting at his desk with a fountain pen, cutting and pasting my speech. And when I say cut and paste, I don't mean a newfangled computer idea. I mean literally cutting it with scissors and sticking it on a piece of paper and moving it around like that. And then we'd take it downstairs to have it typed. So it's like a visitor from Victorian England speaking. So that's how we did it. And it's an absurd way to work, and I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, but it somehow kind of worked for us.
And Darren, I want to pick up tell us a bit more about the speech that you wrote for this and what you could communicate in a speech format that you couldn't really do in any other format.
Well, I think the difference between doing sort of a speech, especially one that you've written yourself, is you get an opportunity to share with people something maybe quite personal to you. So my speech was called It's Just a Preference, and it was about sort of internalized homophobia within the gay community. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily know too much about. So yeah, I thought it was a fantastic opportunity just to sort of be able to say something that I had felt personally from my experiences. And I think that's the other thing as well, is a lot of the speeches that the young leaders have done are actually very, very personal to them. It's not necessarily something that you might sort of find, it's less of a sort of performance. It's more of actually something that we've all experienced ourselves. So.
I thought one of the things that worked really well about your speech is you quote some of the stuff that gets said in dating apps, right? Which is sort of like, no Asians, no femmes, mask only. There's quite shocking language to an outsider who might not think that people are that bold about stating their preferences.
Yeah, and I think the thing about it that really sort of strikes a chord with me especially is that the LGBTQI plus community, a lot of it is founded on this idea of acceptance and sort of, to be proud of who you are and to have pride and, to, sort of not pay attention to what other people say about you. But it's a lot of the time the people within that sort of community have a lot of internal feelings of sort of homophobia, low self-worth, and so what we say to each other, I mean, I've gone on dates with people where a lot of the time they will sort of reduce what I am to, oh, are you a top or a bottom, which, even on stage now makes me feel a bit sort of anxious saying that out loud because it kind of paints a not nice representation of the community, but it does happen, and that's sort of why I did my speech.
But isn't that something that's quite interesting about the difference between written language and spoken language anyway, right? Is that you probably saying that out loud is a much more uncomfortable thing, but whereas you might very easily write that on a dating process. So there's something about a speech that's much more intimate because you're looking at people, you're looking them in the eye. You're having to say those things out loud. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of what maybe Amanda's speech was about, and this idea of like when you write something on Twitter or when you put it out online, it's so much easier to say nasty, mean things because you're not really looking someone in the face or, having to actually have that sort of in front of you confrontation. But yeah, so I think, doing a speech,
it's got an intimacy that perhaps written language doesn't have, which is something, Sam, I want to pick up with you. So if you've got something really, either a great joke or something really shocking to say in a speech of, say, 15 minutes, where do you put it? Like, what are the rhetorical tricks used to make a speech work?
Well, I think you're always thinking about how the speech is going to be received and the circumstances and the audience. And, a lot of the conversation that goes on about why, the art of oratory is dead is because we think, well, back in the ancient times, there'd be somebody standing in the agora dressed in a bedsheet and they'd orate for 45 minutes and everyone would sit and listen patiently, and nobody does that anymore. So, speech adapts to its means of transmission, which means if it's going to be essentially live tweeted or reported in a newspaper or whatever in sound bites, that's how you're going to structure and shape it. The question, and I think Phil's probably going to be better at answering this one, as to where you put your best line or your best gag. I think traditionally you put a good gag or a good hook near the beginning and you put a good one at the end, and you use those as the tent poles through which the speech goes, because of course you want to grab attention, because if people drift off they'll never hear the end of your speech. But at the same time, you traditionally, and this goes right back to classical times, the peroration, the end of your speech, is where you'll put the thing that you want people to remember most, and where you'll put your most powerful kind of emotional appeals, your most flighty, elaborate language, if that's what you're using. You basically, it's a firework display. You want to get their attention to start with, but the 88 gun salute ideally comes in the final paragraph.
So you mentioned this 45 minutes in the Agora. I was reading Mary Beard on the Almeida Figures of Speech website. She talks about the fact, there are these long speeches in classical times that we've supposedly been handed down to us. You have bits of Hansel from the 19th century, someone's supposed to have talked for 6 hours. Were people just much better at listening to boring speeches? Because I've been honest, for 5 minutes and I'm drifting off.
There was no Twitter, there was no Candy Crush, this was entertainment.
Really?
Really? I think it was. One of the classic pivotal moments in the history of public speech, in a sense, was the Gettysburg Address, which famously, actually, everyone says, Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. He didn't. He was simply making a few remarks, sort of second on the bill. The main deliverer of the Gettysburg Address, this gentleman called Everett, gave a speech that went on for 3 hours. He was the most famous orator of his day, and he gave this wonderful Periclean oration with huge classical references. He had a prostate problem, so they had to put a toilet right by the edge of the stage, so you could have a pee before and then a pee afterwards.
Not during, right? Okay.
Not during. No. He knew he could last about 3 hours, and then Lincoln came on afterwards and delivered a speech that went on for 2.5 or 3 minutes, and completely, rendered redundant this classical style that had come before. Gary Wills in his book Lincoln and Gettysburg says more or less, people stepped off that field into a new America, and we are moving towards much shorter, partly because,
You know, we're an attention-starved, you know, multiply mediated society. And there isn't that sort of agora. There isn't a single place where people will stand and listen to a single speech in that way. You know, your audience now is not someone with an earshot. Your audience is someone on the other side of the world who's getting it through the internet. So obviously it has to change.
So Phil, my main job is, as a political journalist, so I listen to a lot of speeches, and I have to say Twitter has been an enormous boon because it allows you just to sarcasm along, which prevents you from wanting to die.
Yes.
But so why do they keep doing them, given that everyone hates them? I mean, but classically a political speech, right? You get a group of journalists, lobby journalists together, you take them to Florence for the morning, deliver a boring speech on fisheries policy, and then go home again. What is the point?
Everybody gets to go to Florence. There are far more speeches than there used to be. I mean, one of the reasons people could listen before, Gladstone and Disraeli would speak 4 times a year, and they'd speak at great length, and that would be the main means by which they carried their political philosophy and their ideas, because politics just wasn't as rapid as it is now. Whereas now, politicians speak all the time. The scope of government is vastly bigger than it used to be as well. The early 20th century state didn't do very much. The late 20th century state had grown enormously. So you've got more politicians doing more stuff, and they all want to talk about it. And the means of a political progression is through gaining attention. So they all do a speech, and it's all very flat and very dull. So there's not much point to most of it, and most of it gets forgotten. I mean, the vast majority of things which are said are unmemorable and are rapidly forgotten. So most of this stuff simply disappears. I suggest that you don't go. Stay at home, turn your phone off, rest, read a book. I often say to people when they say, "Did you read my speech?" I often say, "Well, I haven't finished all of Jane Austen yet." Because I think there's a lot of nonsense said, and most speeches fail because they haven't got a moment. I found this in collecting the best speeches, or trying to work out which ones I thought were the best. And I realised that they're not necessarily the best technically, they're not the most beautifully crafted all the time, they're the words that were spoken at moments of great importance. So unless you've got a great event, you're not going to write a memorable speech. I've lost count of how many politicians have come to me and said, "Could you make me a bit like Barack Obama?" And I always say, let me count the ways in which you're not like Barack Obama.
But also there's a fact about the form itself feels quite stale now. So for me, one of the most important political speeches in recent times wasn't actually a speech all the way through. It's Obama speaking after Charleston, the shooting in a historic black church. He goes to talk at a memorial service, and then he stops the speech and just as a moment of silence, and then he starts singing Amazing Grace with all the history of that song, and the entire church, and this moment of great tragedy suddenly turns into one of uplift.
It's astonishing, isn't it? I recently met the speechwriter in the White House, and I asked him, what was the speechwriting meeting like before that speech, when Obama said, "What I'm going to do is I'll do a conventional speech and then I'm going to sing." I said, "You must have all said, no, you're not."
Stay with me for a minute.
And actually, that's exactly what happened. It was planned. He said, "I'm going to sing." And they all did say, "Are you sure about that?" Because it could have been awful.
Somewhere in Downing Street, Theresa.
That's right, yeah.
I know you love Dancing Queen, but now is not the time.
I'm going to do the sound of silence about 15 minutes in. But it was unbelievably brilliant, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was absolutely spellbindingly good. But I've written before that Obama sings most of the time. I do this exercise where if you read Martin Luther King out yourself, it can move you to tears. If you read an Obama speech, it's much plainer, it's much flatter. There's no great biblical cadence in it. But the way Obama does it, he sings it, is a beautiful way he manages to pull it all together.
Well, let me bring Amanda in at this point, because I find it I watched in real time Theresa May's autumn conference speech in which she lost her voice and then the backdrop fell off.
I watched that, I was going, stop talking.
Okay, yeah, and I'm not even a professional. You are a professional at doing this. In the delivery, what do most politicians get wrong?
Well, it's just, they don't make it interesting. There's no light and shade within what they say. It becomes quite a monotonous, and it's also, if you don't necessarily believe what you're saying, which I think quite a few politicians maybe don't, then nobody else is going to go with you. That's why Obama he's such a good orator, because he's just he's a natural speaker, and he can hold an audience. Whereas whenever I listen to Theresa May, I nod off, you know, because it's the timbre of the voice, and there's no intonation, there's no real inflection, there's no light and shade within anything she says. So immediately you just go, I don't believe you, what you're saying, so why would anybody else? You know, it's all the great speakers, you know, Martin Luther King was a beautiful speaker. You know, Kennedy was. Kennedy, you know, because they played with it, and they relished the words, and there was something about using words and using speech to talk to people. It's a beautiful thing, and it is you have to you can teach it, but you have to there has to be a slight natural ability. I think Neil Kinnock was an amazing speaker, because he was passionate and he believed what he said, and I think that has a lot to do with it. You have to believe. It's all about truth, and it's all about actually believing what you're saying and selling it, and people like to, they just don't, and it's heartbreaking, really, because you think, come on, love, you know, just get behind your own words.
Yeah, I think for anyone who's seen Labour of Love, there's a great montage of Labour leaders speaking, and it has his one where he starts shouting about a Labour council, a Labour council. And you actually, it does exactly that point of light and shade. He doesn't shout continuously for 20 minutes.
No, not at all.
He gives you that. As our official representative of the youth, a title I used to hold, but unfortunately aged out of. When you talk to people, you know, I mean, I know you hang around with probably more actors than the average person in life, but I hang around with more political journalists than the average person in life. Does it feel like a format that is relevant now when people text so much communication is written?
In some ways, I think that makes it more powerful when it is sort of done, because I feel, especially with my generation, it's so much harder to sort of, you know, when I told my friends I was doing a project with the Almeida Theatre, they were like, oh my God, that's amazing, what are you doing today? And I went, oh, I'm writing my own political speech. And then they kind of went, oh yeah, that's cool. But I do think it is really important, especially as there, you know, being a young person, and there's always new issues that need sort of addressing. And I think it's a brilliant platform to do that. And especially the Young Leaders Programme, there were so many varied different speeches. And actually, if you go on the website and you just look at the vast array of different topics that were covered, it's absolutely amazing. I mean, there was people that I had met on the course that had sort of spoken about things that I had no knowledge of before I did the programme. So it is a fantastic opportunity, really.
One of the other things that happens in this series of Freedom Figures of Speech is that there's a Charles Lindbergh America First speech, and there's also a speech by a Polish Jewish guy who was implicated in running the Warsaw Ghetto, and that's what the speech that Tobias Menzies gives, which is give us your children, which is essentially give us your children to send them to a death camp so that the rest of us can live. And Sam, that's something that's always the flip side of the power of rhetoric, isn't it? Is that we fear that it has a slightly dangerous side to it. It's persuasive in a way that people find quite frightening. What are the parts of speech that give it that kind of quality of danger?
Well, I think they're the same parts that give it the quality of inspiration and effectiveness. I mean, you know, all rhetoric is value neutral, essentially. I mean, Cicero would have liked it to be different, and he said, you know, well, good orators also virtuous people, but history has proved him so wrong. I mean, oratory is... you know, one way or another, whether it's classical sort of stand up on your hind legs for 45 minutes type oratory, or the sort of, you know, sound bites on YouTube, a powerful speaker can persuade an audience. And the fear, and it goes right back to Plato, is that somebody who's a powerful speaker may be able to sell you a pup. It's that they're a used car salesman, that they've got a sort of hidden agenda or a secret motive, or that they can make a weak argument strong. And undoubtedly, you can make a weak argument strong, but the only thing we've got to counteract that is, you know, good rhetoric. I mean, in the sense that people would sometimes complain, oh, X is a, you know, I mean, Obama, they always said, he's a person of words. You know, he's an orator, don't trust him, he's a good rhetorician. But that itself is a rhetorical attack. You know, when in Julius Caesar, Mark Antony says, I am no orator as Brutus is, but as you know me all, a plain blunt man. That's bollocks. He's a much better orator than Brutus. But he's already loading the scales by saying, don't trust him, he's doing rhetoric, he's a baddie, I'm just speaking from the heart, I'm a goodie. And
so is that an argument you can make for both Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, who both in their own ways try to sell themselves, and Gordon Brown as well, an authenticity about the fact that I'm not a very polished performer? Or is that just...
Well, it sometimes works. Not being polished is a particular rhetorical appeal. It's a particular way of putting yourself across, as if to say, don't trust me, I'm not as smooth as the next guy.
There's a difference between not being polished and constantly going on about not being polished, which is then a rhetorical lack of authenticity. Of course, not being polished is just a style. I mean, that might be authentic. But if you then turn it into a rhetorical, as exactly Brutus does, then that is a conscious deployment of rhetorical style. Gordon Brown tried to do that. He tried to turn that into his thing. And it becomes as much a rhetorical ploy as anything else. Jeremy Corbyn doesn't quite do that, and Theresa May doesn't quite do that. I mean, Theresa May just isn't a particularly inspiring speaker. But there we are. Which is not to say she's not capable of very good moments, because she is.
Yeah,
there are couple of speeches that Theresa May has done, which I think are of the first class. One to the Police Federation, when she went there and she told them exactly what she thought of them. So if you don't change, well, then we'll change you. Which really hardcore, really tough, and an excellent speech.
That was with Stop and Search and saying basically your institutional racism has got to be confronted.
That's right. It was
toughest crowd to say that to.
It was
the actual police.
And they heckled her and they treated her really discourteously, and she stood up there and she told them how it was. And then long before that, she was the first Conservative politician to say that the public think we are the nasty party. And I think that's the first moment the Tories started to try and change. Again, that was a difficult speech to deliver to that audience. So she's not without her ability at all.
So Amanda, when you started out, did you have an audition speech that you loved?
Yeah, I had a couple. There's a brilliant playwright called Jim Cartwright, and he did a play called Road, and there was a speech at the end by a character called Valerie, and she talks about, she's basically is in a very abusive relationship, and it's like this two-page amazing speech. And then I can't say the play, the Scottish play. There's a speech in the Scottish play that I still love, and that stays with me. But that's the beautiful thing, good words stay with you. I can remember.
Which one is it?
Which one?
Which is the speech?
It's the sleepwalking scene. Oh. Which is great, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And the bit where she says he brings great news when she's just read the letter. So I'm not going to do it. It's not an audition.
Yeah. One of the things I find interesting about this new series is that Andrew Scott does a speech by a woman, and you're doing a speech which is in the context of TED Talks, which is this sort of peculiarly modern thing where you have a big conference. And one of the things I really picked up on is it's difficult. Women don't get to give speeches and haven't classically through history as much. Do you think women's speeches judged differently? When a woman stands up to give a speech, is she judged differently?
I suppose. I think subconsciously, probably we're probably not taken as seriously, just because we're not, are we? I mean, that movement's changing. Hopefully now, there's been a shift since the whole, Weinstein debacle and things like that. So hopefully, the Me Too, movement is changing that. But I think, I don't think women are taken particularly seriously. I think it changed with Margaret Thatcher, probably.
The one great historical example of that is Elizabeth I.
Oh,
one of my favourite speeches, where she goes to address the troops who are gathered
Tilbury.
in Tilbury. The Spanish Armada is waiting to come, and she's the commander of the armed forces. And of course, she's conscious that in going there, she's not to be taken seriously because she's a woman, and that if the mission failed on her watch, it would be attributed to her gender in the way it wouldn't have been for her father. So she goes there to address the troops, and she confronts it head on. And she says, I may have the weak and feeble body of a woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. And it's interesting. She has to cast herself in masculine terms in order to win them over. But she takes on the central accusation against her, which is that she's weak, and she says, don't think it for 1 second. And it's a really strong, tough speech. It's a great speech. Again, a bit like, as Sam said, the Gettysburg Address, that speech is only a few minutes long. So you don't need long if you know what you've got to say.
I'm only smiling because remember Blackadder II redid that. I may have the body of a weak and fear woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a concrete elephant. And then she necks about 50 grams of booze. But that is something that, Margaret Thatcher being the classic example of somebody who had training to sound more like a man. And I think I talk to female politicians now who say the trouble is when a man wants to raise his voice, when he wants to be heard, he booms, right? And if you're a woman and it gets read as you're starting to shriek,
you
become
hysterical, apparently. Do you know what I mean? There is that kind of, there's that feeling, that mentality.
Mary Bear's Women in Power is very good about this, and she says this whole idea of, public speech and the public space not being for women goes right back to the Odyssey. Telemachus tells off his mum, the little whelp, and says, you know, you stick to your knitting, dear. I'm the man of the house now, and I'm going to speak in public. I mean, and, you know, Mary traces that line of thought all the way to the, you know,
I
Twitter.
tell you who's glorious is Michelle Obama, I
Yeah.
think. She's wonderful at me. I've seen some of her speeches, and
In
she's
Philip's book, he says that Barack Obama is the second best orator in his family.
Some brutal cusses of Telemachus, now Barack Obama. Before I open it up to questions, I'm just going to ask you all if you have a favourite speech or speech performance that you would pick. And no one is allowed to pick Barack Obama, because that's just too easy, sorry. Sam?
Gosh, well, the Gettysburg Address is pretty good, since that's on our minds. I think also, obviously, Martin Luther King's Dream speech is pretty good. I know, but these are the good ones. There's a reason we remember them all.
Darren, do you have a...
Mine's from a play. Is that all
Yeah,
right?
no, that's allowed. That's
I've
absolutely
always loved Cordelia's speech in King Lear when she talks about, you know, the whole nothing, my lord. I've always thought that was really beautiful, because the two sisters are there trying to really exaggerate and really sort of, you know, exclaim how much they love the father, but she's very simple and she just says nothing. I think that whole speech is beautiful.
Amanda, he's edited a whole book, so he deserves to go last.
Okay. Well, there's same again. I mean, Lady Anne's speech in Richard III when she's taking her husband, and she says, "Set down your honourable load," and then that whole beautiful thing about how she's lost her husband because of Richard III and what he's done to her, and then he comes in and she just goes for him. I think that's a beautiful speech.
I would have said Martin Luther King, because the last few minutes of that are just peerless, and he does it off the top of his head. He doesn't have a script at all. It's absolutely extraordinary. Churchill's amazing, but my favourite actually is a man called Elisha Wiesel, who was a Holocaust survivor, who did a speech at the White House in 1999, which is called The Perils of Indifference, and it's a beautiful, moving testimony to why politics at its best matters. And in it he quotes my favourite speech of all time, which comes from Death of a Salesman, which Linda Lohman delivers a speech about her husband Willie, which concludes, attention must be paid to such a man. And it's incredible, sort of moving notion of this man who maybe hasn't lived the greatest life, but nevertheless commands respect. And Wiesel has the same idea in the most appalling context of European politics, and that's the one that really got me.
Okay, let's see whether or not we've got any questions in the audience. Just put a hand up. Yeah.
Right, shamelessly, I'm going to admit I'm from Israel. What I find a bit strange, and I do wonder what you think, our Prime Minister has been currently serving his third term, it's probably going to be there for life, and his speeches tend to get ridiculed a lot. He's a great public speaker, obviously he keeps getting re-elected, but he did a terrible speech where, while education and health and everything is basically getting defunded, instead of explaining the reasons, he said, we have to remember the one threat that we have, which is Iran, to remind people that they need to be afraid and keep voting for him. And that speech was very much ridiculed, but he's still getting re-elected. And I wonder if you think that actually making a speech like that is very ridiculous, if it actually helps.
So we laugh at Theresa May mysteriously, she's still Prime Minister. Netanyahu makes a speech like that and stays in. Okay, well, part of that one. Should we take a couple more questions at the same time? Did I see another hand? Yeah.
So I suppose this is more a question for Philip, because it's specific to working with Tony Blair. So I was going to ask, when you worked with Tony, who were your primary influences when you were writing speeches? So who did you draw inspiration from? And also, if you have time, how many of the battles over the editing process did you win versus Tony?
And was there someone in the middle there? Yeah.
My question is about the power of a speech to change minds. So I work for a charity, and we are always trying to kind of bring people around to a different way of thinking and kind of educating them to take action for positive change. And we increasingly understand that takes place after a conversation, after kind of an exchange of views that are based on values rather than someone trying to convince them. Do you think that a speech has the power to change someone's mind just from being spoken at, or do you think it has to have the conversational element?
Well, let's start on the specific one works, because I think it's really interesting in a journey, Tony Blair's memoir, where he talks about the fact he was very influenced by Tony Benn's speechwriting. Two people incredibly far apart politically, but in the sense of how he built up a narrative. And so there are clearly some lessons that apply about speechwriting, no matter what you're arguing for.
Yeah, there are.
But yeah, who won, you or Tony Blair?
Mostly him, because he was Prime Minister and I wasn't. So in the end, you have to yield. So, you know, you are the scriptwriter, you can't impose your own view on it. Eventually, you have to, but you fight all the way through. I often won battles, small battles, over how to say something, but on the bigger questions of what to say, that was set above my pay grade. So I'd have to concede that I lost most of the battles. I tended not to fight battles I wouldn't win. I would husband my resources quite well and just try and ensure that my stray Philip Larkin quote would stay in the text, usually by not telling him where it came from. But Blair had an absolutely unerring ability to spot a really good phrase and then take it out. Because he didn't
It's good that you're not bitter. That's the important thing.
He didn't like poetic language. He liked to be prosaic. And so if ever there was, not that Larkin is consciously poetic, but just my influences, my own influences as a writer were mostly poets. And I wouldn't read about politics at all because it's very flatly written, apart from the obvious ones like Orwell. But I would usually I'd be reading poetry a lot because I wanted the rhythm and the music. So Auden, Larkin, Yeats, Heaney. But every so often, if a phrase crept its way into the text, I remember writing about talent torn off unused once, which comes from Mobard, Larkin. And he said, oh, that's quite interesting. I said, do you like it? He said, no. So he took it out. So he was not someone who was comfortable writing in that way. He was a lawyer, and his style was very forensic. And forensic is the rhetorical term. That's where the idea comes from. And so the task as the writer is to try and find the authentic voice of the person you're writing for. I have this long-running dispute with Mary Beard from various radio studios where Mary says that politics began to go wrong sometime in the classical period when speechwriters were invented and politicians stopped doing their own speeches. And I then thank Mary for attributing the whole of decline of Western civilization to me. I believe she's now making a television program about it. And I say we're not that important, and that actually this relationship between the writer and the principal has gone on forever. You know, it starts with all the way back. So I don't think it's necessarily as detrimental as Mary does. But my influences, I very rarely manage to get through Blair, because what you're trying to do eventually is to just find the best way of describing the words that person would say if they'd had time to prepare it themselves.
Amanda, have you delivered or watched a speech that you can remember, you know, in the way that sometimes a play or a screenplay will just turn on a speech, and where that does change people's minds or change a character's direction?
Well, I remember seeing Judi Dench did The Gift of the Gorgon years and years ago, and she did this speech. It was at the Albury, but I can't remember now what that's called. But I was sitting up there, and she started to do this. She started this speech. She walked to the back of the stage, and then she turned. And as she turned, she said, "I can't remember because it was when I was 18, so it was a long time ago." She turned, but as soon as she turned, everybody just went like that, and she had them, and it was the way whatever she did. She's a genius anyway, but whatever she did, on that turn and that phrase she said when she turned. She had everybody in the palm of her hand, and I'll have to read The Gift of the Gorgon again and find out where it is, but it was an amazing, I remember it being really an amazing speech, and how she presented it, she just got everybody, and you could hear a pin drop, and it was just a magical feeling, because it very rarely happens in theatre. I went to go and see Andrew in Hamlet, and he did the same thing. What he did beautifully in Hamlet was that he made Shakespeare very accessible, and he made it very...
He made it very colloquial, didn't he? It was just immediate, like
he did. And the speeches in Hamlet, he made them sound like they were being spoken for the first time, which is a gift, you know. And she did the same. She does the same thing to Judi Dench. I think, you know, she makes it sound like it's the first time it's being said. It's great.
Darren, presumably some of your friends must now have seen your speech. What has the feedback been like? Have you changed the way that people have thought with that?
I think I've sort of let a lot of people know who didn't know that sort of side of LGBT life. I think from watching the speech, they kind of found out a little bit more about my community and about things that go on. And I think that's the difference as well, is every single community, you know, it's not just exclusive for the LGBT community, but any community, there's all these sort of sub-pockets of lots of different communities as well within that one. So a lot of the time, I think it is important to sort of do speeches if you feel a personal connection to a certain minority within that big sort of picture, because you can kind of educate people into a specific thing that they might not have known about before. Yeah.
So we've had the advice from you about prosaic language and that being something that can do, and the immediacy of language. So Sam, to take away, if we want to change people's minds, we don't want to be mocked for speech writing. What are 3 things? What are 3 great rules of a great speech to take away?
Right. First one is, if you're trying to change the minds of the people you're appealing to, you've got to get somehow on their side and make them feel, I mean, so much of the sort of rage-filled public disputes we have at the moment are about people actually trying to rally their own troops rather than persuading the people on the other side of the argument. So it's like, you know, death to you people is in fact is a rhetorical appeal essentially aimed at your own side, promoting, you know, tribal solidarity. So persuasion is much more about, you know, hey, where's the common ground? In terms of what makes, you know, if your spoken language is effective in as much as it's memorable, and how do you make something memorable? You repeat it. How do you make something memorable? You repeat it. Most of the fancy Greek words for the figures of speech, the tropes, the turns of language that make speech effective, I mean, about 80% of them basically words repetition, be it repetition at the beginning of a set of sentences, at the end, repetition of vowel sounds, repetition of consonant sounds. Memorable phrases, memorable speeches, repetition does, you know, the classic advice is, you know, how do you structure a speech? You tell someone what you're going to say, you say it, and then you tell them that you said it. So I think that's, you know, basically pretty powerful. You wanted 3, didn't you? Also, make them laugh, because laughter is involuntary assent. You know, even if you disagree with everything somebody says, if they make you laugh with them, as a little part of you is on their side.
There we go. I'm sending you away with useful advice. Watch Darren and Amanda's videos, buy these guys' books, and thank you all very much for coming. Please give a big round of applause for my panel.